Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In case you guys have missed it, there's a new trailer for the final season of The Clone Wars. One of the best part of this trailer is where we see Ahsoka Tano get asked why she walked away from the Jedi Order. She explains that the Jedi were trained to be peacekeepers and not necessarily fight as soldiers in a larger war. It's a statement that really explains what is wrong with the Jedi's role within the Galactic Republic military, and it's a sentiment that's parroted by a lot of individuals serving within the Grand Army of the Republic. You had analytical individuals like Captain Wilhuff Tarkin, who was very well versed in the Jedi Code and believed that the code severely limited a Jedi's ability to be a good soldier. He also mentioned that peacekeepers should not be leading a war. Some more aggressive and militaristic Jedi like Anakin Skywalker agreed with the sentiment and perhaps wished that they could do more in order to fight the enemy forces. Then you have other Jedi like Barriss Offee, who carried out attacks against the Jedi ironically because she believed that the Jedi Order had become extremely violent and lost its way by committing to the war. Now clearly there were many troubling signs that the Jedi Order was crumbling under the pressure of the war even before Palpatine had carried out Order 66. There were some who believed that the Jedi Order would fracture by itself or some dark side element would just take control. But what I'm really interested in is taking a very objective and not biased view of whether the Jedi actually made good soldiers and good officers. First, let's take a look at their training, indoctrination, and skills. All Jedi were Force-sensitive individuals who could greatly manipulate their surroundings and themselves, making them essentially superhumans. But not all Jedi were chosen to become Jedi Knights. Only the Jedi younglings that seemed to have natural abilities and skills along with the right temperament would be selected by a master for training, which could then lead them to knighthood somewhere down the road if everything went well. Most Jedi younglings would end up serving in other departments like agriculture or the archives or some other non-combat role. Just like any organization, there were plenty of jobs behind the scenes that you never saw. The process of weeding out the weak from knighthood meant that the Jedi Knights that did make it to the battlefield were the cream of the crop. So there is no doubt that on a battlefield, the Jedi were extremely formidable fighters. They were almost kind of like hero units who were extremely hard to kill and could swing momentum of the entire battle in your favor with one heroic charge at the enemy. Now, the Jedi Order was very hierarchical and had a very rigid structure and set of rules. After the Ruusan Reformation, all new Jedi recruits were taken from a very young age. This way, they wouldn't develop their own competing worldviews before joining the Order. The Jedi really wanted to shape every one of their members' childhood developments and protect them from the temptations of the dark side, but that also meant that the average Jedi was pretty unprepared for the actual real world and all the violence out there, and also the temptations of the dark side. The Jedi Order had an extreme amount of power and control over their members. By removing them from their families at such a young age, they essentially isolated the Jedi younglings and made them dependent on the Jedi way. The Jedi Code would further reinforce this idea of obeying the Jedi Order and the High Council. Like any organization, the Jedi were guilty of groupthink and isolating and punishing those who thought outside the box, like Qui-Gon Jinn, for instance. Another organization that recruited their members from a very young age were the Clone Troopers. If you really think about it, the clones and the Jedi had a lot of common traits. First, they were isolated from their families or just didn't have any families and saw their organization as their family. The clones and the Jedi were also seen as outsiders by the general population and were kept away from having normal lives. This detachment from family and society made them better soldiers in many ways. A Jedi is more willing to sacrifice him or herself for a cause, just like a clone, because they have no family waiting for them that requires their care. Now, the Jedi Code wasn't completely negative. There were actually a lot of positive parts of the code that helped make Jedi better soldiers. This detachment from fear and emotions helped them keep a distance from the men they led into battle. This allowed the Jedi to make the hard choices and sacrifices necessary for victory. Whenever emotion is involved in a command decision, it's harder to see the entire picture, which is quite important when you're an infantry or naval officer that is taking a part of a larger campaign. But then you have parts of the code that forbade the killing of unarmed opponents and pressing an attack when the enemy is no longer threatening you. This would be the part of the code that individuals like Tarkin would really disagree with. So if you look at a preemptive attack now, instead of looking at it from the strategic point of view, you're going to look at it from an ethical point of view if you are a Jedi. But if you ask someone like Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's the whole point. We need individuals on the battlefield who are not just blindly following orders and focused on strategic objectives. We need individuals who are outside of the military structure and looking at the actions of the military through a different set of standards. If a faction like the Galactic Republic started bombarding a separatist world and killing innocent civilians because there are war factories also built into their cities, that could become a big problem. That would sort of justify the separatist claims that the Galactic Republic had lost their mandate to run the galaxy. So some might say that it's a good idea to have the Jedi deployed to the military kind of as an ethical watchdog. Whereas others like Tarkin would say that the Jedi cause confusion and disorder within the military structure, and their allegiance to the Republic is subverted by their own religious and ethical beliefs. Now, Tarkin does have a point here. The Jedis are the one who accepted the commission to the Grand Army of the Republic, making them essentially soldiers, and because they're in the military, they kind of have to follow the rules of the military or else nothing would ever get done. The Jedi could have refused their commissions and just served as volunteers in a non-combat role. Or they could have served as conscientious objectors with a very specific contract that would be different from what a combat soldier has to sign. This will allow them a little more room to kind of pursue their ideological or ethical belief systems. But of course, the Jedi, perhaps through their arrogance or maybe through their sense of duty, felt like they needed to fight for the Republic military instead of just fighting for the betterment of the galaxy as a whole. Now, throughout most of history, the Jedi were aligned with the Republic and they had various connections with the government there, but they didn't always support the Republic military in every war. As we mentioned before, the Jedi are peacekeepers. So what does peacekeeping mean, and how does that separate them from being a soldier? Well, the definition and objective of a peacekeeper is pretty simple. It's a person who tries to prevent or stop arguments or fighting between two or more peoples or groups. The key thing here is that a peacekeeper tries their best to not take sides. As a matter of fact, the only thing that is more important than their neutrality is their main mission, which is keeping the peace. The Jedi were deployed to settle disputes, sometimes as diplomats between two nations or systems, sometimes as negotiators between the Republic and a corporation. Sometimes they had to keep the peace by hunting down a fugitive. Jedi rarely killed fugitives, unless it was a Sith, but that's a whole different discussion. And they were usually expected to bring those fugitives in alive so that they could stand trial, because in a fair and just society, we have systems to prove if someone has committed a crime or not. If the Jedi were just going around like Judge Dredd and carrying out extrajudicial killings, that would not be keeping the peace. It would be degrading the public's trust in the system that keeps the peace and bring about chaos. A soldier, on the other hand, is an individual who serves in an army. Oftentimes, soldiers are deployed as peacekeepers as well. Whenever the UN deploys the blue helmets in conflict zones, they're usually trying to prevent further fighting from breaking out. That is, whenever they're not supporting the local sex industry, trafficking humans and drugs. But of course, these UN peacekeepers have also been deployed in offensive operations as combat soldiers against the North Koreans in 1950, when the North invaded the South. So basically, a peacekeeper can serve as a soldier, and a soldier can also act like a peacekeeper. That much is pretty obvious. But what really determines what an individual would be good at is what their individual training is like. A Jedi is trained more like a religious monk and martial artist, with some parallel training you might see a civilian organization like the police undertake. The Jedi are definitely trained to de-escalate situations, uphold the law, and bring people to justice. And so one of the biggest issues with the Jedi being commissioned as officers and leaders for the Republic was their lack of military training. Unlike police, soldiers are trained first and foremost for combat on battlefields. Soldiers are trained to be aggressive and focus on the mission and its results. Sure, there might be special rules of engagements and emphasis on limiting collateral damage and civilian casualties, but they usually have a lot more aggressive options than a policeman would. The police are generally less aggressive and focused on gaining cooperation and talking to suspects and dealing with other civilians, not combatants. And so in the first battle of the Clone Wars, we see that the Jedi leaders have very little military training or understanding of how to lead a massive military force. A lot of these earlier grand strategies that we saw the Jedi deploy were quite stupid and simple, and usually limited to frontal assaults without much strategy involved. This, if anything, is the biggest issue with the Jedi taking command. Like everything else about the Republic's acceptance of the clone army, it was rushed and not very well thought out. But given the time they had to prepare for the Battle of Geonosis, it is kind of understandable. Most of the Jedi who would survive their initial stupidity would eventually learn how to become real military leaders, and generally were quite competent, for the reasons we mentioned before. But there is one other larger issue, and this is whether the Jedi generals and officers could last a prolonged war, especially one that eventually got bogged down into a war of attrition in the Outer Rim sieges. If we look at the Jedi's past history, the Jedi oftentimes would sit out major conflicts, especially when the Sith weren't involved. During the Mandalorian Wars, the Jedi Council stood back and let the Republic fight the war. It wasn't until a young upstart called Revan broke away from the Jedi Order and started his own crusade against the Mandalorians that we actually saw any Jedi join the war. Unfortunately, the brutality of the war against the Mandalorians was so great that many Jedi basically turned to the dark side in desperation. The reality is that dark side force powers gave a combatant far more options in a battle, and when you've already seen millions of people die in a pointless war, all you really want to do is end it. Ideology be damned. During the New Sith Wars, Lord Hoth fell into a similar trap and heavily militarized the Jedi Order in an effort to destroy the Sith. Although Hoth had strong convictions and never turned, many of the Jedi under his command did. He also led a massive amount of his Jedi to their deaths. The most reasonable argument against the Jedi serving as soldiers is that their belief system and Jedi code did not stand up well against real-life hardship and the terrors of warfare.
War is an extreme situation, and most people have to go to extreme lengths to survive. A Jedi's entire life is about balance and keeping themselves in check. Now, some Jedi, like Mace Windu or Yoda, or even Anakin, were skilled enough in the Force to give themselves some ideological breathing room. They were rarely pushed to the limits, even in the most dangerous battlefields. They were able to maintain mental and ideological discipline. But of course, Mace Windu and Yoda were special individuals. Most Jedi found themselves in life and death situations all the time and in need of more power and more tools to fight the enemy.
The Jedi were lucky that the Separatists mainly fought with lifeless automatons. Imagine how much worse the war would have been for them if they had to kill sentient beings instead. So while I believe that the Jedi belief system is not compatible with warfare, I also believe that we need to stop labeling individuals by their groups. Each individual Jedi had their own strengths and weaknesses. Some actually made great soldiers and commanders. Others were just weak, cowards, and untrustworthy. And so we should always look at the individual, whether we're looking at Star Wars or at our own society. It's not a good idea just to judge people by the groups they associate with. And if you believe in humanity first, that is the least you can do for your fellow man and woman. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.